with Pearl Harbor igniting the fire in the belly of the beast that was the United States military. World War II had made its way to the Pacific, bringing in more parties to the bloody struggle and creating a whole new theatre of conflict. Following on from their surprise attack on the Hawaiian port, Japan's rapid expansion was continuing unabated, with invasions pushing quickly forward into the British-controlled colonies of Hong Kong, Malaya and Singapore, leaving their soldiers confident and battle-hardened. As the fighting continued throughout the early parts of 1942, the Empire of the Rising Sun expanded their defensive perimeter towards Australia. In the northeast, they began closing in on US territory. In these months, Japan saw their greatest victories and the Allies' many losses. But while it was a dominant period for the Imperial forces, it was also the beginning of the end, as it saw the Allied armies gradually increasing their levels of resistance to a point that the Axis enemies could not stand up to. While the window of opportunity before the US rebuilt their navy was exploited by the Empire to indiscriminately bomb and shell Allied fortifications and citadels, their first point of attack was Hong Kong, which fell to Axis troops on Christmas Day 1941. The Allies garrisoned there had held on longer than anyone had expected. Though surrender had been inevitable, 6,000 troops held off 40,000 enemy for several weeks. The Japanese campaign in Burma took much longer. Burma was a prize highly sought. It provided the British with a gateway to India, the jewel in the colonial crown. What's more, since 1938, the Burma Road that ran from Mandalay to Kunming had been the only overland supply route for the nationalist forces fighting the Japanese in China. With China joining the Allies and declaring war on Germany, Italy and Japan, the American General Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe as he was known, joined the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek as his chief of staff. Though they were successful in repulsing a Japanese attack in China on January the 15th, their success was short-lived. The Japanese were already in Burma. They did not let the dense jungle hinder their ambitions. Where roads were blocked, they simply took to the undergrowth. British-trained Burmese forces were unable to halt their advance. In the Commonwealth of the Philippines, the Allied forces were commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The Philippines had been officially made a territory of the United States as far back as 1902. However, despite their firm entrenchment in the locale, American forces found holding on to this colony far from easy. Defending the thousands of islands that comprised the Philippines was a nightmare. They lay 8,000 miles from the American west coast, but only 200 miles from Japanese-held Formosa. To defend them, General MacArthur had the equivalent of 2 divisions of regular troops, 16,000 US regulars and 12,000 Philippine scouts. Add to this the fact that in the months leading up to war, days were calm and languid, with social events dominating the agenda, leaving troops and equipment in anything but top-notch condition. As the conflict wore on, though, these weren't the only problems. There was too little food, too little ammunition. Sickness and malnutrition set in. The American-Filipino force, racked by dysentery and malaria, continued to fight, but disease and lack of proper sustenance claimed more lives than the enemy. After 2 weeks hard fighting, the American and Filipino troops withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula on the west side of Manila Bay. There, MacArthur could pursue a strategy of defence and delay, shortening his lines and using the mountainous, jungle-covered terrain to his advantage. Furthermore, he could deny the Japanese the use of Manila as a port. Perhaps he could even hold out long enough for a relief force to be mounted in the United States. But it wasn't just bullets and shells the Allies were faced with. The Japanese launched a propaganda war in the skies over the Philippines, dropping thousands of leaflets on Allied troops, insisting they had no hope, pressing for their surrender. But there was no capitulation. By March, it was clear that relief from the United States main forces would not be coming. MacArthur was given the order by President Roosevelt to leave the islands and take command of operations in the Southwest Pacific. He begrudgingly complied. Despite this, though, the beleaguered remaining forces held on for several months after MacArthur's departure, with his final words becoming a rallying cry for all those left behind: "I shall return." However, his leaving the embattled island was anything but easy. On March the 12th, he boarded a motor torpedo boat under new orders to take command of the communication lines between Australia and America that were now coming under threat. From his boat, MacArthur boarded a plane for Darwin. His B-17 Flying Fortress staggered into the air from Del Monte Airfield, Mindanao, with one engine spluttering. The 5-hour flight took him and his staff over the captured enemy islands of the Celebes, Timor, and the northern part of New Guinea. Somehow, they managed to avoid enemy Zero fighters. As they finally reached Darwin, they found that it was under Japanese attack, so they diverted to Batchelor Airfield, about 50 miles away. When they eventually disembarked from the aircraft, a weary MacArthur remarked, "It was close, but that's the way it is in war. You win or lose, live or die, and the difference is just an eyelash." Some US Navy officers had given MacArthur only a 1 in 5 chance of escaping the Philippines. Via the radio airwaves, Tokyo Rose had boasted that the Japanese would capture him. But MacArthur and his family made it out. It was from this new Australian base that he would conduct the next phase of operations. However, the Philippines wasn't the only Southeast Asian battleground to see heavy combat between the Japanese and Allied forces. Elsewhere, imperial expansion had been just as aggressive, fueled by several factors, the most important of them being their dwindling stockpile of oil. These had been cut off by the US when the empire had invaded China, causing potential supply problems in the not-too-distant future. They needed oil to keep the war machine turning, and the best way for them to get it now was to take over the West East Indies, their next target. Japanese troops had first landed in Sumatra early February. Despite a valiant defence by the local populace, along with Dutch and British soldiers, Java fell in early March. Continuing their advance through this region, Imperial forces were also making their way across the jungles of Malaya to another important target, Singapore. The British had been in residence since 1819, when Sir Thomas Stamford Bingley Raffles founded a trading post there. It soon became a valuable British outpost, and Singapore's rapid growth and importance to the British East India Company ensured that the British were there to stay. In 1824, the status of Singapore as a British possession was cemented in an Anglo-Dutch treaty that divided the Malay archipelago between the two colonial powers, the British controlling the area north of the Straits of Malacca, including Penang, Malacca and Singapore, whilst the area south of the Straits was assigned to the Dutch. In 1940, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill had been responsible for Singapore's defences. He was convinced that should the island be attacked, it would be by sea. He informed his cabinet colleagues that Singapore is a fortress armed with 5 15-inch guns and garrisoned by 20,000 men. It could only be taken after a siege by an army of at least 50,000. Furthermore, he noted that Singapore was as far from Japan as New York was from Southampton. He thought it impossible to maintain men and munitions over such a distance. He also didn't consider it plausible at that time that the Japanese, who he described as a prudent people, would extend themselves beyond the Yellow Sea and China, where they were already occupied. Surely they would not embark on so mad an enterprise so far from home. Churchill was wrong. To combat the expected sea-based Japanese force, he dispatched 2 battleships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The Prince was a King George V class battleship which had a brief but active career, its hand in the sinking of the Bismarck being the highlight of its war service. HMS Repulse was a renowned class battlecruiser, the second to last battlecruiser built. She too had taken part in the chase of the Bismarck. The Admiralty had planned for an aircraft carrier to accompany the 2 ships, but the action never materialised. HMS Repulse left Singapore in company with HMS Prince of Wales and 4 destroyers to try and intercept the Japanese invasion convoys heading towards Malaya. But their hunt for invasion forces proved fruitless, and they turned south. It was at this point that Japanese aircraft were spotted. The fleet was attacked by 86 planes. Without the protection of an aircraft carrier, the ships were very vulnerable. The force the British thought to be an unsinkable deterrent was sunk, leaving the coast of Malaya exposed. General Yamashita could now make a move. His assault on Singapore would be down through Malaya, and as the British had been slow to send troops north from Singapore, Malaya was badly defended. The assortment of untrained pilots and inferior Allied equipment in Malaya, Borneo and Singapore at that time were no match for the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. Their fighter aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, were instrumental in achieving air superiority. It wasn't long before Allied forces began falling back. After a 54-day campaign against Japanese troops, they could no longer hold back the tide, and the Axis soldiers began a steady march that was closing in on Singapore. The defence of this colony lay under the command of Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who'd roughly 100,000 military personnel from Australia, Great Britain and India at his disposal. This was more than 3 times that of the opposing Japanese commander, General Yamashita. Later in life, Yamashita would recall his thoughts on his invasion plan and what a nervous time it was for him and his men. My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked. I had 30,000 men and was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. I knew that if I had to fight for long for Singapore, I would be beaten. That is why the surrender had to be at once. I was very frightened all the time that the British would discover our numerical weakness and lack of supplies and force me into disastrous street fighting. The Japanese strategy was a wily one. At midnight on the 7th of February, Japanese troops landed unopposed on Singapore's northeast coast, and they gave the impression of an impending attack from that direction. However, the next day, they began a strategic air and artillery attack on the northwest coast instead. By 9:30 that night, the first Japanese amphibious assault on Singapore was launched. Undeterred by heavy casualties suffered from Australian machine gunners, wave upon wave of Japanese troops landed successfully. By midnight, the Australian defence was broken. Despite a clever plan to turn the naval defence guns against the invading Japanese, casualties on the Imperial side remained low, as the only rounds available were armour-piercing, designed to puncture ship hulls. If high-explosive shells had been to hand, the outcome of this invasion may have been a lot different. With his troops well established on the northern shores, Yamashita's next objective was Bukit Timah, commanding the northwestern approach to Singapore town. Yamashita called upon Percival to surrender, but Percival had strict orders to fight till the end. A bitter battle was fought where the Japanese 18th Division faced the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Malay Regiment, supported by men from the Australian forces. The Allies fought stubbornly and kept the Japanese onslaught at bay until the midnight of 12th of February. But as the odds grew too great, the Malay Regiment retreated. Up on Bukit Chandu, Allied soldiers ran out of ammunition but refused to give up. They engaged the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat, but it was no use. By the afternoon of 14th of February, Bukit Chandu was taken. By this time, the Japanese advance had forced British troops to fall back to a perimeter around the municipality. This was their last defence. Around this, the Japanese converged. The end was imminent. With water supplies falling to critical levels along with the last reserves of food, ammunition and fuel, General Arthur Percival made the decision to surrender the island to General Yamashita. He did so in an abandoned Ford motor factory with a final message to his superiors stating, "All ranks have done their best." The creation of an East Asian co-prosperity sphere, free from the shackles of the Western empires, had long been the desire of those ruling Japan. By April 1942, it seemed that the empire of the rising sun was vaster than it had ever been before. The war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific had been highly successful, and the Japanese were now in control of the most strategically important parts of the Chinese coast and had occupied Malaya, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies and most of Burma. In the Pacific they held Wake Island, New Britain, the Gilbert Islands and Guam, and while the drive to seize new territory continued, the outlook was grim for the Allies. In the first few months of the war with Japan, valuable British and American outposts had swiftly fallen to the invading forces, and thousands of people were now prisoners of war, helplessly caught behind enemy lines. Even Singapore, once regarded an impregnable British fortress, had been crushed by the Japanese, dealing a devastating blow to Allied commanders. America, in the meantime, had lost valuable military bases and would soon lose its foothold in the precious Philippine Islands. With the main Allied naval forces in the area destroyed by the unhindered Japanese Air Force and surrounding territories almost entirely under Imperial control, troops at General MacArthur's old command didn't have much hope of victory. When the Japanese launched their new air and artillery assault, breaking through Allied defences, the men who were worn out from malnutrition, sickness and combat fatigue were too weak to counterattack and surrendered. Some of the Allied servicemen managed to escape to Corregidor Island to the south of Bataan, but battalions of Japanese infantry swiftly moved in and pushed the defenders back to Malinta Hill. To the despair of all those left fighting, the American flag was soon lowered, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who'd taken over from General MacArthur, had no choice but to accept General Masahiro Homa's terms of surrender. As a result, by May the 8th, 1942, the Philippines had been officially lost. But there was an even greater tragedy for the Allies to face as the Philippines fell. The Japanese had captured 80,000 Allied prisoners, all of whom needed to be transported to prison camps, and faced with such a huge task, it was decided they should walk 60 miles to a railhead at San Fernando. What was soon dubbed the Bataan Death March began on April the 10th, and it proved to be a terrible ordeal for the men who were already malnourished and sick. Thousands lost their lives as a result of exhaustion, hunger, dehydration and sickness, while many others were brutally murdered by their captors. It was a stark warning that going to war with Japan would be costly in terms of casualties, as the POWs were treated with bitter contempt by the Japanese soldiers, who regarded surrender as dishonourable. While the American war machine was still recovering from its blow at Pearl Harbor, it had begun to get back on its feet and was preparing for the next round. As news of the treatment of the men at Bataan reached the US, the public were galvanized beyond their already patriotic state. The resolve of the Allies to crush the Japanese was now more determined than ever, and President Roosevelt had already set in motion plans to strike at the very heart of Japan by bombing its capital city, Tokyo. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had been keen to restore public morale. In light of the later events in the Philippines, he was now eager to demonstrate to the Americans and the people of Japan that the Empire of the Rising Sun was not invulnerable to attack. On top of this, since Pearl Harbor, Japanese descendant immigrants were being treated with heavy suspicion. Many items of contraband were seized from anyone described as an enemy alien. This included shortwave radios, cameras, binoculars, and various weapons such as hunting knives and the dynamite used by farmers to clear land. Los Angeles Congressman Leland Ford wrote, "I do not believe that we could be any too strict in our consideration of the Japanese in the face of the treacherous way in which they do things." With the full backing of the American people and their governmental system, the American military were finally gearing up to go to war for real. Months on from the catastrophic attack at Pearl Harbor, the Navy, Air Force and Army were all ready to take the fight to the Japanese. The seemingly unstoppable force of the Empire of the Rising Sun was about to meet head-on the seemingly immovable object of the United States. The first target, however, was Tokyo, and in a similar fashion to their eastern enemies, the US was planning a sneak attack of their own, something that would require engineering skill as well as military know-how to complete. The tide of the war in the Pacific was about to change, but it was a long way from being over.